Over the past few days, I've been replaying Naughty Dog's The Last of Us in preparation for the sequel which comes out next week. This was my 5th time going through the game and it's still as impactful and memorable as ever, but beware, there are mild spoilers ahead, but only for part 1. It's certainly not a perfect game, and I'll get onto that later, but it's still one of the best examples of video game storytelling, and very few games even compete with it in terms of writing. It originally came out in 2013 on the PS3 before being remastered for the PS4 in 2014. Both versions are incredibly critically acclaimed, and for good reason. I got the game on my birthday for PS4 in 2016, and within 3 days I had completely finished it. As fate would have it, that would also be the exact same day the very first trailer for part 2 was aired. So before the sequel comes out, which may divide the fanbase even more than the leaks already have, I'd like to talk about how important this game is to me in what I'd like to call a rambling retrospective. I've always said that characters are more important than plot, and The Last of Us is just one of many examples that perfectly encapsulates that idea. If you have a bad plot but still have good characters, overall you have a good story. However, if you have bad characters even with a good plot, overall the story won't be that great. The Last of Us' story certainly isn't the most original thing in the world either.
Alone in a zombie-infested apocalypse, one man and a mysterious immune young girl are humanity's last hope.
That plot clearly borrows heavily from things like The Walking Dead, The Road, 28 Days Later, and Children of Men, but it's the characters of Joel and Ellie that set this story apart. One major detail that does distinguish this story is that they fail, not through adversity or an unconquerable enemy, but through the weakness of the characters themselves. The world could have been saved if Joel didn't behave selfishly, understandably, but selfishly. He truly believes he's being selfless by saving Ellie, but in the process kills dozens of soldiers and dooms countless more to die from the continued outbreak. Whether it's the right call or not is left open for you to decide. And that's before you even get to Joel's lie and whether or not Ellie believes him. Personally, I think she does know he's lying, but hopefully we'll see some of this play out in part 2 in addition to Ellie's revenge quest. All of this is moved forward by the characters. Characters should move the plot, not the other way around.
Move along. Move along.
The two main characters, Joel and Ellie, are two of the most authentic, genuinely flawed, and perfectly acted characters of any medium, not just gaming. There's a reason so many games in the past few years have tried to emulate The Last of Us in terms of setting, characters, and tone. This is everything from AAA games like Red Dead Redemption 2, God of War, and Days Gone, to smaller indie titles like A Plague Tale: Innocence and Hellblade. During the peak of the negativity around The Last of Us Part 2, which is not what this video is about, don't worry, I read a comment that claimed that neither Joel or Ellie have any character development.
Oh, come on!
I had to reread that tweet multiple times because I just couldn't fathom how anyone could come to that conclusion. I can understand if you don't like those two characters, but saying they have no development is just incorrect. All you have to do to realize that is compare how Joel treats Ellie when he first meets her in summer.
Whoa, I don't think that's
I'm
the
not
best
Ellie.
idea.
Him?
You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad. It's me.
He tried to...
Oh, baby girl. It's okay.
And then to his final words to her.
I swear.
We see him move from reluctant and self-serving to compassionate and loving as he recaptures what he lost after the death of his daughter in the opening section of the game, leading him to do terrible things to keep her safe. Perhaps it's not the most complicated of developments for a character, but it's a very human experience full of nuance and subtlety that may go unnoticed. Joel's watch is probably the most important visual cue for his character and is very, very simple. His daughter Sarah gives it to him in the very first scene, but by the time we see him 20 years later, it's fully smashed.
Your watch is broken.
Why would you keep wearing a watch that is smashed and presumably doesn't work? This is a simple but very effective character tell that shows us he hasn't let go of his past, despite constant efforts to move on from it and ignore it. Every so often you'll see him touch it when he's looking at Ellie or thinking about the past, which is obvious symbolism for him coming to see Ellie as his own daughter.
This watch is me.
Now, it's impossible to talk about Joel without mentioning Troy Baker's career-defining turn in the mocap suit. Baker has voiced dozens of different characters in all kinds of video games, but his run as Joel has become one of the gold standards of how to write and perform a good, multi-layered video game protagonist. Sarah's death at the beginning of the game took multiple takes and a reshoot to get just right, but as a result of Baker's talent and director Neil Druckmann's dedication to getting it right, it's undeniably one of the best scenes ever made in a game.
Don't do this to me, baby. Don't do this to me, baby. No. 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 Please.
As Joel, the player sees him do horrific things to get what he wants. The game doesn't have any sort of narrative choices that can be influenced by the player, allowing Naughty Dog to tell a very focused and specific story. Other games might have shied away from making the player be the one to doom humanity, possibly giving you the opportunity to go for a quote good or evil ending. Instead, Naughty Dog doubles down on making Joel, and therefore you, the player, the bad guy in the situation. But importantly, the game doesn't dictate how you should think about Joel's actions, but leaves it open to judge for yourself. This made for one of the most compelling and interesting endings to a story I've ever experienced, and one that was incredibly divisive at the time. The game doesn't demand that you like or approve of Joel's lie to Ellie, but it does force you to accept it by removing any choice you had in the matter. It seems like a lot of people have forgotten quite how divisive that ending was, so it surprises me how upset some people are by certain aspects of The Last of Us Part 2. Whether you agree or disagree about the different story beats or character decisions, and trust me, I've got plenty of my own skepticism, I'm still glad Naughty Dog's team had the conviction to go for it, even if it does end up as hot garbage. Anyway, whatever, I'm not here to talk about Part 2, I'm here to explain why I love Part 1 so much and why you're wrong for thinking otherwise.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
The Last of Us wouldn't be what it is without Ellie.
Ellie is the little girl that broke your fucking finger!
In an incredibly bleak post-apocalyptic world ravaged by a terrible infection, it is Ellie who brings a sense of innocence and levity to the game that saves it from being totally depressing. No, don't get me wrong, it's a pretty depressing game. But without Ellie's sense of whimsy, the game would have been constantly glum and wouldn't have been half as impactful. The scene which undeniably exemplifies this is the iconic giraffe scene.
What are you doing?
It's all right. Come here. Hurry up. Come on.
Hey there. So fucking cool.
Quiet and cheerful moments like this punctuate the horrors Joel and Ellie have been through and the terrible trials that are yet to come. Having grown up in the new world, her naivety about the simple things we take for granted is another part of what makes her a valuable character. While creating her, Neil Druckmann has publicly admitted that he had a hidden agenda to create a three-dimensional female character without her ever being sexualized. Despite referring to the infamous outrage merchant Anita Sarkeesian and his agenda during his talk, he did still succeed in his goal, as Ellie is one of the best written video game characters in recent memory, regardless of her gender. And so much credit for that has to go to her actor Ashley Johnson, who was in her 30s despite playing a teenager. Going forward with her as the main character in the sequel has always made sense to me, especially since the winter section where you take control of her is the best part of the original game anyway. Now, it's taken me a long time to get to the thing that actually makes The Last of Us a video game: the gameplay. And the reason it took that long is because that's the weakest part of the game. But Henry, how can you say this game is so good if the gameplay is the weakest part? Now, the gameplay isn't terrible by any means, but it has more than a few flaws, and at this point, it's pretty dated, since the original did come out back in 2013. I love stealth games, and The Last of Us has a strong emphasis on stealth when handling dangerous encounters, so that's generally the way I play. However, the options you have at your disposal with stealth are fairly slim. What I like most about stealth games is manipulating your enemies to work for you, but there are few options to actually do this outside of throwing a few bricks to distract them. Other recent and similar titles have managed to improve this, such as Days Gone, where you can exploit freakers to take out human encampments for you, though that game has plenty of its own issues. This is something I'm really looking forward to about Part 2, but Part 1 leaves much to be desired in many areas of its gameplay. Most encounters don't require much in the way of differing strategies and boil down to crouching behind cover and choking out as many enemies as you can before one spots you and then you just shoot them all. The shooting itself has always felt a little stiff as the game leans into its realistic approach, but ultimately it's just not as fun to control as it could be. I've played the game on a number of difficulties, and playing on harder levels like Survivor or Grounded is definitely the way The Last of Us should be played if you want the full survival horror experience. Not only because the enemies are tougher or because you take more damage, but because the amount of resources available. As with pretty much every game for the past 10 years, there is a crafting mechanic, but this does make sense given the game's setting. On normal difficulties, or even hard as I played most recently, you can find more than enough resources in the environment, which makes things a bit too easy. easy. Bullets are frequently dropped by most enemies, and useful scraps can be found in pretty much any building. On survivor mode, these valuable resources are significantly reduced, forcing you to treasure every bullet and wait for that guaranteed headshot, making every missed shot feel so much more punishing. This makes you more cautious and deliberate in what actions you make and what risks you take.
I also like to live dangerously.
These risks and more extremely limited supplies force you to think of strategies that you otherwise wouldn't need to even consider on easier difficulties. Ellie can be useful for these encounters as she gives you extra items she finds in the environment and will join you in a skirmish, but while she is an essential element of the story, mechanically speaking her role has been better done by other games. 2018's God of War had a similar father-child setup with Kratos and Atreus, but Atreus is much more useful than Ellie from a gameplay perspective. He will find health crystals, shout out advice about enemy attacks, and fight back independently, or you can manually trigger him to fire arrows. Both Ellie and Atreus become more capable as their games and stories go on, but it's even more pronounced with Atreus. However, I doubt Sony Santa Monica could have told that kind of a story with God of War if Naughty Dog hadn't laid the groundwork with The Last of Us. Music is really important to me in video games. Good music can elevate a poignant moment into something truly profound, or misplaced music can take something that's meant to be serious and leave you in stitches. Gustavo Santaolalla's score to The Last of Us is some of the most perfect video game music ever recorded. Now, assuming I've not had to change it for copyright reasons, you will have heard his music throughout this video. And his music isn't just great because I like the sounds he makes, but because it encapsulates everything about what The Last of Us is, which is exactly what a good score should do. It's used very sparingly throughout the game, often with little more than a few plucks of a guitar string to highlight a particular moment. To me, it's right up there with the Force theme from Star Wars, a piece that is such a cinematic masterpiece that it may never ever be topped. Santaolalla's main theme for the game, just called The Last of Us, evokes everything from despair, desperation, and horror to a strange sense of hopefulness that everything will be okay in the end. These feelings are exactly what The Last of Us is all about, and his music is one of the things I'm genuinely most excited for about the sequel.
Okay.
Many people criticize The Last of Us by saying it's just a movie and there's not enough gameplay, and while I certainly understand that perspective, I still think it's quite a reductive viewpoint to take. The relationship between Joel and Ellie is the core of the experience, and this manifests through gameplay as much as it does through cutscenes and cinematics. There are multiple opportunities for both characters to share in optional dialogue moments that can explain fun pieces of lore, or where they just exchange character details to each other.
That's too small of a grave.
I forgot to leave that stupid robot on his grave. What should I do with it?
Ellie.
What? I want to talk about it.
No.
Why not?
How many times do we need to go over this? Things happen, and we move on.
It's just...
That's enough.
You're right. I'm sorry.
Let's get to Tommy's.
The relationship, and therefore the emotional story beats, wouldn't nearly be as strong if the player was just a viewer, i.e. if it wasn't a game and was just a movie with zero interactivity. Despite the leaks being the elephant in the room for everyone talking about Part 2, I'm still really excited to get back into this world and see how it holds up to the first game. And thus concludes my rambling retrospective, so please let me know what you think down in the comments. Did you love The Last of Us 2 as much as me? Would you like to see more of these types of videos? I'm not sure how many I'll make because this took bloody ages. It's okay if you're not into Part 2, it doesn't make you a sexist, racist, transphobe, or any other word that Twitter might throw at you, but please don't spoil it for anyone in the comments. I'd rather we just wait to play the game for ourselves to decide if it's trash or not. Anyway, that's it from me. Endure and survive. Bye for now.
To the edge of the universe and back. Endure and survive.
Excuse me?
Savage Starlight. That comic I've been reading? That's what the hero says after a big battle.
Endure and survive.
Yeah.
Okay.